Hi everyone, my name is Jacqueline Lukeman and this is Brick by Brick. Thanks for joining me tonight, and I am continuing what I'm hoping is a very interesting discussion that you are maybe not enjoying but are learning quite a bit from. It's a discussion on racism, but not from the perspective of what racism is and what racism isn't. I've been talking about the ways in which even people who are liberal minded, well meaning white people, and even some black people sometimes, say things in response to people who are trying to have an honest discussion about white supremacy and racism so that we can fight it, and the way some people respond that is actually more harm than good. Now, in the past episode, I talked about the definitions of racism, of white supremacy, of privilege, which was very eye opening for me. And I hope that tonight is going to be eye opening for you too. Because tonight I want to talk about this idea that people have, and this has got to be, I think, one of my, I don't know how to describe it, most favorite, least favorite, most annoyed. This is one of the most annoying things I hear people say in response to racism. It's probably one of the things that gets me the angriest, maybe one of the maybe top two or three things. I already talked about a couple of those things. Another one of those responses is that black people can be racist too. Racism goes both ways. Watch the episode from last week to see why that's not true. But tonight I want to talk about this idea that it's not about race, it's about class. Or sometimes people will say, well, it's about class. It's not about race. And tonight I want to explain to you why that idea is a lie. So recall from the first episode that even though both European and African indentured servants were pretty much on equal footing in the colonies, in what was becoming the Americas, there was no designation of black or white then. Africans and African descendants were here before the transatlantic slave trade, and there were European descended residents and settlers, and there were African descended residents and settlers, and they pretty much identified themselves by their country of origin, or they identified themselves as landowners or indentured servants or Christian or non-Christian. So there wasn't this idea of black and white in the early settling of the colonies. So then there came a period of time, just a quick synopsis for you guys. There came this period of time where a free black man, because indentured servitude was not like slavery. Indentured servitude was for a particular a finite period of time. It was a labor contract. Now, it's absolutely true that indentured servants were treated horrendously in most cases, but there was no extra harsh treatment for black indentured servants as opposed to white indentured servants. As a matter of fact, a lot of European indentured servants came here because they were criminals in Europe. And as a part of their lighter punishment, instead of being sent to the gallows, they were given the opportunity to be transported to the colonies and to work off their debt to society. And they were abused horribly. They were violated by the people who held their contracts. But their contracts were for, as I said, a finite period of time. Those contracts ended. And if the indentured servant worked through that contract at the end of that contract for sometimes 4 years, sometimes 7 years, sometimes 14, they would be paid freedom dues. It is also very true that tens of thousands of indentured servants died, tens of thousands ran away, and there were indentured servant uprisings in the colonies against landowners. But again, there was no racial aspect. There was no racialized difference between the treatment of indentured servants who were African descendants and indentured servants who were Europeans until the case of John Punch and Anthony Johnson. Now, remember, I said in the last episode that a lot of white supremacists, a lot of history revisionists like to say that Anthony Johnson was the first person to start slavery in America, and that's ironic because he's a black man. Well, here's the thing: it wasn't Anthony Johnson who decided to punish John Punch, who was an indentured servant who ran away with two other indentured servants who were European. John Punch was African. It was the judge who decided the sentence of John Punch, not Anthony Johnson. So Anthony Johnson, a free black man in the Americas, in the early colonies, didn't start slavery. It was the judge who sentenced John Punch not only to being whipped as the two European indentured servants were sentenced to, but their sentences were extended by only 4 years. The judge sentenced John Punch to a lifetime of servitude to Anthony Johnson. That wasn't Anthony Johnson's decision, and he could not rescind it, change it, even if he sold John Punch's contract because of the way the ruling was worded. John Punch was sentenced to serve his entire life, the rest of his life, in servitude, regardless of who held his contract. So from that point in the history of what would become America, even poor whites began to receive advantages, or, like we talked about last week, privilege that blacks never could going forward, just by virtue of the creation of this thing called whiteness, to justify the different treatment between people who formerly called themselves European, German, Polish, Irish, or Christian, or landowner, or indentured servant, or Ethiopian. See, before 1800, free African American men had nominal rights of citizenship. In some places, they could vote. They could serve on juries. And they worked in skilled trades. But as the need to justify slavery grew, and racism began solidifying in the colonies, free blacks gradually lost the rights they did have through intimidation, changing laws, and mob violence committed by white people against black people. Now they're white, and now there is this group of people called black people. And this mob violence, these changing laws, this intimidation happened even in the North. See, we all know about the racism in the South, so there's really no need to talk about that much. But let's look at why racism in the North made class an absolute moot point, even for free blacks. See, in the northeastern states, blacks faced discrimination in many forms. Segregation was rampant, especially in Philadelphia, where African Americans were excluded from everything, from going to concert halls, from riding public transportation, from public schools, from churches, orphanages, everywhere. Blacks were also forced out of skilled professions, which they had been working in. There were working class people, there were middle class people. And soon after the turn of the century, African American men began to lose their right to vote in Philadelphia and in the surrounding Northwest states. Now, the right to vote, even for African American men, was granted by many states following the Revolutionary War. colonies at the time. My apologies for calling them states. We weren't states at the end of the Revolutionary War. So at the same time, black men are losing their rights. Simultaneously, voting rights were being expanded for whites. New Jersey took the black vote away in 1807. In 1818, Connecticut took it away from black men who had not voted previously. In 1821, New York took away property requirements for white men to vote, but kept them for blacks. This meant that only a tiny percentage of black men could vote in New York State. In 1838, Pennsylvania took the vote away entirely. The only states in which black men never lost the right to vote were Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. I have to look at this again. I have to go back to New York, taking away property requirements for white men to vote, but kept them for blacks. This meant that only a tiny percentage of black men could vote in that state. That meant that white men, regardless of whether they had property or not, regardless of whether they were landowners or not, could all of a sudden vote in New York State. This is in opposition to what was practiced before, where only land-owning white men could vote. Now, all white men, landowners or not, could vote. And the few black men who owned land could still vote, but we know that those black men weren't allowed to hold on to their property for long, don't we? So the situation in what was then the Northwest region of the country was even worse. If you thought Philadelphia and the Northeast was bad, the Northwest was even worse. In Ohio, the state constitution of 1802 deprived blacks of the right to vote, the right to hold public office, and to testify against whites in court. Black people couldn't testify against white people in court in Ohio. Over the next 5 years, more restrictions were placed on African Americans. They couldn't even live in Ohio without a certificate proving their free status. What I talked about last week with the papers laws. This was one of them. They had to post a $500 bond to pay for their support in case of want. And they were prohibited from joining the state militia. In 1831, blacks were excluded from serving on juries and were not allowed admittance to state poorhouses. They had to have papers to prove that they were free. They had to pay the state $500 just in case they fell on hard times and the state had to take care of them. But then they were also denied admittance into poorhouses in the event they did fall on hard times. So the state basically took black people's money and gave them nothing. Not only were black people barred from being admitted into state poorhouses, they were also barred from being admitted into insane asylums. This idea of black people's mental health being ignored is not new. It's almost as old as this country. Fortunately, some of those laws were not stringently enforced, and some abolitionists worked really hard to fight against them. But for states like Ohio, it was practically impossible for black people to immigrate to Ohio. Ohio simply did not want black people, and that's regardless of a black person's standing economically or socially. Illinois was another state where there were several severe restrictions on free blacks entering the states. Free blacks. Indiana barred them altogether. Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin, no friendlier. And because of this, the black populations in the northwestern states never exceeded 1%, and they are still very, very low today. Have you ever wondered why there aren't a lot of black people in the northwestern and midwestern states? The history is why. Not only were there laws that targeted free black people, blacks escaping from slavery, blacks who were skilled laborers, blacks who were middle class, all blacks, but African Americans also faced violence at the hands of white northerners. There were individual cases of assault and murder that occurred throughout the North, throughout the history of the growth and expansion of this country. And that's on top of the daily racist insults and harassment and indignities that black people had to face. As a matter of fact, between 1820 and 1850, northern blacks also became the frequent targets of mob violence. Whites looted, tore down, and burned black homes, churches, schools, and meeting halls. Angry mobs of racist white people stoned, beat, and sometimes murdered blacks. Philadelphia, again, was the site of one of the worst and some of the most frequent mob violence. City officials in Philadelphia generally refused to protect African Americans from white mobs and even blamed blacks for inciting the violence with their uppity behavior. See, that's very important because uppity, if you don't know what it means, basically means that you're trying to be better than people think that you should be. You're putting on airs. And it's a particular insult for black people because very frequently, as I just showed you, white people thinking that we were trying to step outside of our place, that we were trying to be uppity, could cost us everything we had, everything we'd worked for, and it could sometimes cost us our life. So this isn't something that was done to just poor black people who had nothing. It wasn't something that was done to just slaves. This was something that was done to black people who were actually working to improve themselves. And for that, everything they worked for was taken from them. They were uppity. But it's about class and not about race, right? So by the time race-based chattel slavery was fully instituted and entrenched in the southern colonies and later the states, the enslaved who escaped to the north realized that the north was no promised land. Because the color of their skin, as much as it condemned them to enslavement in the South, it also condemned them to racism and violence in the North. To the fugitive slave fleeing a life of bondage, the North seemed to be a land of freedom. But upon arriving there, the fugitive found that though they were no longer slaves, neither were they free. African Americans in the North lived in a strange state of sort of semi-freedom. The North had emancipated its slaves, yes, but it was not ready to treat blacks as citizens. And really, the North wasn't even ready to treat blacks as human beings. See, because Northern racism grew directly out of slavery and the ideas that were used to justify the institution. This wasn't an issue of class. This was an issue of the color of their skin makes them inferior to us. That is racism. The concepts of black and white, remember, didn't arrive with the first Europeans. and the first Africans, but they grew on American soil. During Andrew Jackson's administration, racist ideas took on a whole new meaning. Jackson brought in the age of the common man, and under his administration, working class white people gained rights that they hadn't had before, particularly the right to vote. But the only people who benefited were white men. Blacks, Indians, and women were not included. And at the same time, there was this influx of European immigrants who were also pouring into the North. And many of those people did face class discrimination and hardship in their native countries. But in America, European immigrants found that they had more rights here than they had in their home countries. And those rights were expanding rapidly because they had entered a country in which they were part of this created, privileged group, this created group that were given special rights that other people didn't have, called white. Of course, classism and ethnic prejudices did exist among white Americans, and it had a tremendous impact on people's lives. Yes, wealthy white people were horrendously abusive to poor white people and to poor immigrants. Absolutely. But the bottom line was that for white people in America, no matter how poor or degraded they were, they knew there was a class of people below them. Poor white people were considered superior to blacks. All of them. Not just slaves, not just the laborers, but all blacks. And to Indians as well. Simply by virtue of being white. Because of this, most European immigrants, no matter how poor they were, no matter where they came from in the world, no matter how much oppression and discrimination they faced in their home country, and no matter how much they were discriminated against, even by wealthy white people, many of them identified with the rest of the white race in America and defended the institution of slavery. And working class whites, many of them even did this even though slavery didn't benefit them directly. And in a lot of ways it worked against their best interests. But they received benefits from whiteness in this country that they did not have in their home countries. And that was the only thing that mattered. Things came to a boiling point. That's not quite the right way to describe it. The idea of race as more than just a social construct, but as a legal designation in this country was solidified, I guess you could say, with the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Because it was in that decision where the Supreme Court of the United States formally declared that blacks were not citizens. So in March of 1857, the United States Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Robert B. Taney, declared that all blacks, not just slaves, not just laborers, but all blacks, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. The court also declared the 1820 Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. If you go back to a few episodes, I talk about the 1820 Missouri Compromise during the episodes I did on slavery. Thus, the Dred Scott decision permitted slavery in all of the country's territories. So the case before the court was that Dred Scott It was Dred Scott v. Sanford. And Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin before moving back to the slave state of Missouri. And he had appealed to the Supreme Court in hopes of being granted his freedom. But instead of being granted his freedom, Chief Justice Taney, a staunch supporter of slavery and intent on protecting Southerners from Northern aggression, wrote in the court's majority opinion that because Scott was black, he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The framers of the Constitution, he wrote, believed that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever profit could be made by it. Referring to the language in the Declaration of Independence that includes the phrase, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, Taney reasoned that it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race was not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. Now, Taney was not referencing the Declaration of Independence accidentally. You see, at that time, most of the justices on the Supreme Court were slaveholders, or they represented or they were from slave-owning states. And as we know about the Founding Fathers, most of them at one point were slave owners also. So Taney wasn't reading more into the founding documents than what was really there. He was merely interpreting those documents through the reality of the fact that most of the founding fathers were slaveholders themselves, and if they weren't, most of them held very racist views toward blacks in general. So it made perfect legal sense to him to declare that blacks had no rights that a white man had to respect. No white man had respected the rights of black men in this country up to that point. Of course, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to people born in the United States, regardless of color. But here's an interesting aside, and I have to make this note. The 14th Amendment did not extend that equal protection under the law to Native Americans. And I talked about this also in my series on Standing Rock, why history shows that Standing Rock is not new. I talked about how the court concluded that Indians were not citizens under the 14th Amendment, while recognizing that Indians were born in the United States in a geographical sense. They weren't citizens. Just as children born within the United States of ambassadors or other public ministers or foreign nations weren't citizens. So the court declared that citizenship must be directly bestowed upon the Indians by the United States. They were called Indians at that time. So in other words, Native Americans were illegal. They were legal aliens, rather, in their own land. That's what the Supreme Court decided in regard to Native Americans. So in 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which allowed Native Americans to become citizens if they abandoned their tribes and adopted habits of civilized life. It was generally assumed at the time that civilized life meant that they could speak English. They had to become Christian and were actively engaged in farming. It wasn't for their profit. Then in 1924 and again in 1940, Congress passed legislation granting citizenship to all Native Americans. Again, I talked about that in pretty good detail, and I think it was the last episode of the Standing Rock series. I encourage you to go back and take a look at it and see the very long history of denying citizenship and rights to Native Americans. So when we talk about racism in the United States in regard to anti-blackness, it's not that we don't recognize that the same type of racial hatred wasn't directed toward Native Americans too. Absolutely, we know that it was. But here's the thing I don't understand. When black people talk about anti-black racism in the United States, we get responses like, well, what about the Native Americans? I mean, they went through so much more. If you can recognize that Native Americans were treated with unfairness and discrimination based on race, how do you not recognize the same thing was done and continues to be done to black people? Especially since this racial hatred and violence that was directed at black people was directed at black people who established themselves in many ways and were successful. See, a lot of the racial hatred that black people experienced at around the turn of the century wasn't because of economic issues, as some people like to frame it. No, it really was because white people didn't like the fact that black people were doing as well as they were. But it's about class and not race, right? Ida B. Wells actually found out that wasn't true. In March of 1892, Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist and former Memphis school teacher, started a crusade against lynching. I know you all know who Ida B. Wells is. After 3 of her friends were brutally murdered by a Memphis mob. Tom Moss and 2 of his friends, Calvin McDowell and Henry Stewart, were arrested for defending themselves against an attack on Moss's store. He was a business owner. Moss was a highly respected figure in the black community, a postman as well as the owner of a grocery store. A white competitor, enraged that Moss had drawn away his black customers, hired some off-duty deputy sheriffs to destroy Moss's store. Moss and his friends, not knowing that the men were deputies, resisted. Well, who wouldn't? A gun battle broke out, and several deputies were wounded. Moss, his 2 friends, and 100 other black supporters were arrested. Several nights later, masked vigilantes dragged Moss and his 2 friends from their cells, took them to a deserted railroad yard, and shot them to death. Enraged by their deaths, Ida B. Wells lashed out at the refusal of Memphis police to arrest the well-known killers. Everyone knew who they were. She encouraged blacks to protest with boycotts of white-owned stores and public transportation. This was in 1892. Now, do you really think a white store owner would hire a posse to burn down the store of a white competitor? Here's the thing. Like many middle-class African Americans, Ida B. Wells had accepted this myth that only poor blacks were lynched for heinous crimes. Wells was now shocked into recognizing that even innocent middle-class black people could be targets. And interestingly enough, as she investigated the reasons for lynching, she discovered that a number of the victims were lynched not for rape, but for having sexual relations with consenting white women. This wasn't about class. Lynchings were not about class. They were all about race. It was punishing the uppity Negroes for not staying in their place, for not continuing to live subserviently to the superior white man, to dare to aspire to be better than a slave. That's what lynchings were about. That is why so many victims of lynchings were business owners. Ida B. Wells learned that in most cases, the justification for lynching was based on trumped up charges leveled against local black business owners who posed an economic threat to competing white businesses. She compiled a laundry list of offenses that justified the lynchings, which included anything or nothing. Economically powerful black people were a threat. Not just economically powerful people, but black people in particular. Because if race wasn't an issue, why weren't there just as many white business owners who were competing with other white business owners who were lynched too? But it's about class, not about race, right? Well, of course, poor blacks caught hell just as much. Black sharecroppers who were trying to unionize for better wages, again, trying to be uppity, trying to be better than white people thought they should be. In Arkansas, in Lane, Arkansas, black sharecroppers tried to unionize to demand better wages. And in 1919, 237 of those black sharecroppers were lynched by a mob of angry, racist white people who did not want black sharecroppers to have more than what they had. As a matter of fact, successful, independent, self-sufficient black communities were destroyed repeatedly through history by racist white mobs. This was not a situation where white people were jealous of other people, another generic group of people who were gaining some type of success just as they were. No. They saw black people coming together, building community, and being successful without their help. They saw that black people did not need them, that black communities were self-sufficient, and black people were gaining economic empowerment. And white people could not have that. So all across this country, in the early 1900s, angry racist mobs of white people destroyed, ate, and probably more that we've never even heard of at this point, successful, self-sufficient black communities. Not Italian, not Polish, not Jewish, not German. Black. But it's about class and not race, right? the argument that class has been the problem in this country and not race is further disproven with the phenomenon of the Red Summer of 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 occurred when Black World War I veterans were attacked. Their homes and communities were damaged or destroyed, and Black people of all classes were victimized and murdered by racist white mobs in over 30 cities across this country. And this horrible, horrible incident, this horrible period of time was so terrible that it caught the attention of W.E.B. Du Bois, who actually wrote a poem about this horrible racist violence that Black men who had fought for their country had to come back to their country to fight. In his poem, Returning Soldiers, Du Bois says, "We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade. We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land." Why? Because we return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. 1919, or the Red Summer of 1919, was marked by racial violence of white people against Black people, riots caused by white people, destroying Black neighborhoods, in major incidences of unrest in Chicago, Washington, D.C. I just told you about Elaine, Arkansas, and many smaller clashes in both the North and the South. White mobs killed 77 Black Americans, that's what was documented, including 11 demobilized servicemen. And this was according to the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. During the time, the property damage to Black businesses and homes, attacks on which betrayed white anxiety over new levels of Black prosperity and social power was immense. Everything we had built, so much of it was destroyed. Not because of class, but because white people didn't like Black people aspiring to a class higher than slave or servant. Even educated, well-to-do Blacks were subjected to race-based discriminatory laws and practices. Jim Crow didn't exclude wealthy Black people. Even if they were free, Jim Crow did not exclude wealthy Blacks. Discrimination and racism in the North didn't miss educated, middle-class Black people. It applied to them too. Something else that affected all Black people across all class lines was redlining. The FHA didn't guarantee any loan on a mortgage that a Black person applied for. Any Black person. This is how redlining so many middle class and upper class Black people ended up living in neighborhoods with poor Black people until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed that outlined, that outlawed on paper anyway, the practice of redlining. But even as middle and upper class Blacks moved out of the cities that they were forced to live in because of redlining and into suburbs that they were previously denied entry to, they still faced discrimination in housing and white flight. And that is why today so many Black suburban middle class and upper class enclaves exist. Check out this short video on redlining and how it affected the black community when it was implemented and even today?
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
So as you can see, we still deal with the legacy of redlining today. And as a matter of fact, wealthy blacks are still profiled by the police in many ways. You've heard all the stories on the news, Dave Chappelle being stopped by the police. Because being wealthy and driving a nice car while black in some areas will get you pulled over, or worse. Do you remember the story in New York City about the black woman who was committed to a mental institution because the police didn't believe that a black woman driving a luxury car was legit, especially when she said that Obama follows her on Twitter. They put her in a mental institution. Or how about the story of the retired black Major League Baseball player who had a neighbor call the police on him? The police approached him as he was shoveling snow from his own driveway. The police approached him as if he were some random black guy wandering around the nice neighborhood trying to make some extra money shoveling snow. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years. Or how about Professor Henry Louis Gates? Maybe not one of our favorite people all the time, but still, him being arrested on the front porch of his own home. He had lived in that neighborhood again for years, but somehow his white neighbors thought he was just some random black guy breaking into that house. And we all remember the ridiculousness that ensued with Beergate and... But those are just a few examples of wealthy black people who, even though they are not working class, they're not poor, they're still victims of discrimination and racism today. As a matter of fact, there's a great interview that I think came from U.S. News. Oh, I'm sorry, it came from CNN, the money section of CNN, where Sheila Johnson, the wife of Bob Johnson, the founder of Black Entertainment Television that's now sold to Viacom, makes some very interesting comments about being in the black 1%. Because I talked about last week how people say that, well, black privilege is a thing. Is it? When Sheila Johnson, who has created and runs her own exclusive resort here in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, says there is a loneliness that very wealthy African Americans do feel in their lives. No matter how much money you have as an African American, you are still an African American. Because, see, it took her more than 10 years to build the Salamander Resort and Spa, an elegant 168-room resort sitting on 340 acres of pristine land in Middleburg, Virginia. But even with the wealth she had amassed, banks were still reluctant to lend her money. She said there were people out there that said to her, "You don't know what you're doing. You're an African American woman. I don't know. You don't know about the hotel business. It's not going to work because I've never seen anybody black do anything that has excellence." She was told these things. And of course, the fact that she's a woman made it even more difficult for her to get a loan. There's another interesting, and I thought very poignant and heartrending. Actually, no, it's enraging story from this same article. And it's about the experience that a black couple in the 1% went through when they were trying to sell their house. Take a listen to what the realtor told them.
The 1%, as you well know, is overwhelmingly white. We're talking about the top tier of Americans who have and own a majority of the nation's wealth. These are people who are uber rich. There are a few African Americans who have made it to that tier. But compared to the number of whites in the 1%, they are literally a percent of the 1%.
So why is the 1% so white? It has to do with something called the racial wealth gap.
For every dollar of wealth held by the typical white household, the typical African American household owns only 6 cents of wealth.
6 cents. You heard right. So how did we get here?
When you think about wealth, you have to understand that it's generational, that wealth left over generations actually compounds and builds and grows. African Americans were held as slaves and they weren't allowed to earn any income. They weren't allowed to own things at one point in this history, and that actually has contemporary effects.
Effects Eddie Brown knew all too well, but was able to overcome.
Then we bought the building next door, because since we didn't do that, we bought this. And then just September ago, we bought the next one too. So Brown Capital is basically all 3 townhouses.
Today, Eddie is the CEO of Brown Capital, a firm with over $8 billion in assets under management. Along with his wife Sylvia, the Browns are hoteliers, patrons of the black arts, and philanthropists.
Eddie and Sylvia Brown led the way towards making this building a reality, one of the largest gifts from an African-American family in this nation's history. So you were born to a teenage mother in the Jim Crow South, on the wrong side of the track.
On the wrong side of the track, which means, as they say down south, dirt poor.
But there's another concept, though, that people say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. This is America.
You know, our pastor used to say, people make that statement. What they don't realize is many people don't have boots. So you got to help get the boots. Then maybe they can lift themselves up.
Is there an obligation, particularly in communities of color, to give back?
I feel very strongly that there should be. I mean, how did they get there? Surely a lot of it was talent, but somebody had to look out for them and help them along the way.
Despite their success, the Browns have still faced certain barriers to wealth creation. Homeownership is one of the pillars of wealth, and blacks continue to face discrimination in the housing market.
You know, we've sold a couple of homes over the years, and I remember the realtor said, let's take down photos so one seeing the home that's white won't recognize it as being a black homeowner. And I was just shocked. We were shocked. They said family photos around, they all should come down if you want to get
A sale.
well, a good price.
So
I think it's really incumbent upon us who have achieved some modicum of success to make it our business to mentor and to uplift.
There is no reason why we shouldn't have more people of color in the 1%, showing that, you know, that their talent can be reflected in terms of financial well-being. The data actually shows that people of color who are in job-creating positions hire more people of color.
Now here are members of the 1%, and they're black. And black people who are members of the 1% are literally 1% of the 1%. It's like maybe 6 families, if that much. And even with all of their money, with all of they have actual wealth. With all of their influence, when they went to sell their house, the real estate agent still told them that they would have a better chance selling the house if white homeowners didn't know that the house belonged to black people. So take all the pictures of your beautiful, successful, upper class family down. But it's about class and not race, right? You see, when you know the data, when you know the numbers, when you know that unemployment for black college graduates is still almost twice that for young white college graduates, even after the recession and the alleged recovery, you know that it's not just class that's causing the continued and persistent disenfranchisement and denial of equal opportunity and income inequality that black people face more than other groups of people. When you know that professionals, black people at every education level, are paid less than white people, regardless of the job, regardless of the experience, everything being equal, black people are paid less than white people. When you know this is true, there is no way you can continue to believe that this is a class issue. Because even at the advanced degree level, this is at the highest, the upper echelon of education, and presumably that would translate into the upper echelons of business, of employment, of work life. Even in those upper echelons, black people with advanced degrees are still paid less than white people with the same degrees. So we can continue to respond to black people's persistent conversations about the persistent, pervasive, systematic white supremacy and racism that continues to perpetuate this inequality, this lack of access to equal opportunity, this discrimination, this disenfranchisement. Many well-meaning white people can continue to respond to our demands for these issues to be acknowledged and addressed with, it's not race, or it's about class now, it's all about race. You can keep responding that way if you want to. But when I know the history, and the history that shaped this country, that the foundation of this country was built on, was racism. Not just against us, against Native Americans too, and sexism against women, but many of our laws and much of our national psyche is based on the idea that there is one group of people on the bottom underneath everyone else, that everyone else can feel comfortable and confident in knowing that we will always be on the bottom, because that is how the system was designed. When we know that our refusal to acknowledge that truth and do the really hard work to dismantle that thinking, those negative thoughts and ideas and stereotypes about who Black people are and what we have a right to do, and Black people being uppity and what we deserve. When we do the uncomfortable and hard work to dismantle the system of white supremacy and racism in this country and build a new foundation on equality, equity, and justice, if we do that, if we take the time to focus on the problem so that we can do that, we will be a much better country and we'll be a much better people for it. But we will never get there as long as white people continue to respond to our demands for justice, equality, and equity against racism and white supremacy with, it's about class, it's not about race. For white people who are the victims of the machinations of the elites, who have taken jobs from the Rust Belt, who have shipped jobs overseas from Silicon Valley, who have abandoned Middle America on infrastructure, and who have raped our public school system, and now they're in the process of privatizing it so you have to have money in order to be able to send your child to a public school or to a primary school. Yes, for white people in this country, it absolutely is about class. Absolutely. I'm not saying at all that class is not a factor in this war that has been raging in this country between the haves and the have-nots. Oh yes, class is a factor. But for Black people in this country, historically, and for Native people in this country, historically, regardless of what class we belong to, regardless of what our socioeconomic status and achievement is, regardless of what our level of education is, regardless of how much money we have in the bank and how much wealth we have to our name, how big our stock portfolio is, how much property we own, how much clout we have, the color of our skin, and the negative connotation and stereotypes and the history that goes along with it trumps all of that. It always has. And until we recognize that that is the truth, it always will. We cannot end racism and white supremacy by making excuses for why we don't want to talk about racism and white supremacy. So I think that's the end of my topics that I want to talk about in this series on racism and how we respond to it in ways that are more harmful than helpful. I have one more episode left though. And in that episode next week, I want to go back to those slides because I want to take those slides apart a little bit. And I want to explain to you, I want to show you, I want to open those slides up and show you what those numbers mean in the everyday lives of Black people in America, and why we cannot continue to ignore racism. Not if we really want to be the better nation that we actually have the potential of being. So thank you very much for joining me this week. Please follow us on Facebook. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Brick by Brick. We are on Twitter now. Follow us on Twitter. There is a donate button on the YouTube channel, so please help us grow Brick by Brick. Help us improve the quality and the content and expand what we're doing. Everything you do to help us is greatly appreciated. Share this video at the end of this video after our adorable Furteen Brewski has his say. Click on the notifications button to make sure you get live notifications when we are going live. And join me next week, Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for another episode of Brick by Brick. I am Jacqueline Lukman. Good night.
Building it brick by brick.
Too many new things that I have not educated myself on with like the OBS software with the new webcam, but